for the get-go, who are you and where do you come from?
Okay, so I'm Robin Carhart-Harris. I come from the United Kingdom. I live in Oxford and work at Imperial College London in West London. And I research psychedelic drugs. I've been doing that for since about 2009, so for about 8 years.
What is your field of study?
I say it's psychology. Fundamentally, it's psychology because, in my view, psychology is the sort of mother discipline from which you would put neuroscience and psychiatry. I sort of see psychology as the sort of more basic discipline.
Do you think neuroscience is something more than just biology?
Yes, at least human neuroscience.
Oh, that's an interesting categorization. That's right, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, if it's not humans, it would be behavioural and physiology. But I suppose it's virtually always with a view to translation to the human mind and behaviour.
So when it's done on rats, it's purely biological, but when the same thing done is on a human brain, it becomes psychology, in a way.
Yeah, in a way. But even when the work's being done in animals, it's usually with a view to a translation up to humans.
You spend a lot of time with animals observing them, right?
Not me personally.
Okay.
No.
At any stage of your studies, you haven't.
No.
Okay.
No.
Do you remember kind of like the first times being, I don't know, late teenager or something, when these things happened, that when you realized that I maybe want to study or do something around mind or brain or something like that? When did you gain an interest on anything in that direction?
Yeah, well, I think it was in my teens, and I think it was through struggling a bit, really, in my teens, and wondering why, because I'd been such a happy child up until my teens, and then thinking, this is weird, and so just being interested in why that should be a case, and also probably a feeling that it was a shame that it was the case. This is unnecessary, because there wasn't any obvious reasons for me being, say, anxious or whatever. And so that led me to just be interested in that, I suppose. In mind, fundamentally. Brain came later as I sort of, heard, I suppose, a bit more about the relationship between the brain and the mind.
Do you remember how, or can you give a figure, like how old were you when you became conscious about consciousness, or started thinking about consciousness?
Wow. In my teens, yeah. But such a rudimentary awareness of it, I hadn't done any reading. But just sort of reflecting, I suppose, in my own space. I suppose the main initiation into formal study of psychology happened when I started doing an A-level in psychology. So
A-level is...
Yeah, what's that equivalent to? Well, I'd be, in terms of age, that's about when you're 16 or so.
Okay, yeah. So for us, it's maybe high school psychology.
Yeah, it's what you do to get grades to potentially go to university.
Oh, yeah.
So,
okay.
At the end of high school, the very end of high school. And actually, I started at a grammar school. Well, I was at a normal, what we call a secondary school, high school. Then moved to a grammar school to do my A-levels. But dropped out. I wasn't a very good student for a number of reasons.
Was mind one of them?
Yeah, let's say it was. Altering the mind. And then just had a moment of clarity where I realised I needed to sort things out, I suppose. And I went to a college, a kind of comprehensive college, and that really helped because it put all the responsibility on me to do my work rather than being kind of tutored in a sort of top-down way.
Yeah. When it becomes your own choice to study, it really changes things.
Yeah, and that was really helpful. And one of the A-levels I was studying was psychology, and I had a particularly good psychology tutor. Gosh, what was his name? Oh, I wish I could remember.
You can't remember.
No, but no, he was actually quite inspirational.
So you're basically here because of somebody and you don't remember his name.
Yeah, isn't that terrible? I would have said it's Murray, but I don't think it was. And then I just got immersed in psychology, and I remember being in the first lesson, and the psychology teacher said, "Oh, who's the most famous psychologist?" And I didn't know. And then I was told, "Oh, it's this guy called Sigmund Freud." And I thought, "Oh, wow. Well, I need to look into this guy." And so I read in the psychology textbook that we'd been advised to get for the course about Freud and his ideas, and I read about the Oedipus Complex.
And that's what?
That just really, it shocked me.
What's Oedipus Complex?
It's the idea that in infancy, a young boy, it has a focus on boys really, fall in love with their mother.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that they have a romantic attachment to their mother.
I know the Finnish pronunciation of the word, so
really?
it didn't ring the bell.
Yeah. And they have a antagonistic relationship with their father and see him as a kind of love rival. And this just really shocked me, and it had this weird effect on me, and I thought, wow, that's just mind-blowing. I wasn't that critical in my reading and understanding of it. All I can say is it affected me at an emotional level.
Did it make sense?
Yeah. And so that frightened me, and then I thought, oh my goodness, the mind is really something quite deep. And I think, from there on, in a circuitous way, I became just increasingly interested in mind and brain.
I think I had some sort of a similar experience not that far ago. Maybe a couple of years ago, I decided that I want to go to a therapy when I don't feel like I need one. Like I want to go when everything seems to be okay, and I can create a relationship, and whenever I need it, I have it already. And the guy I went to is coming from a Jungian background.
Jungian,
and he started talking about, like, I first get to know the dude, and then I like what's the Jungian background and what it's all about. And he told me about the subconsciousness and the second mind. And then not that far like not that long time ago, I did something. I come from a religious background. That was wrong in the sense of the religious upbringing. And then I thought about it, and I went through the thing, and I was like, I'm completely fine with it. Like it fits in my worldview. And then the next night I went sleeping and woke up completely covered in sweat and bad dreams in a very, very, very like intense manner. And then I talked about it with him, and he was like, that's exactly what Jung talks about. Like there's a subconscious mind that haven't handled with the things the way your conscious mind has. And that kind of takes me, like the thing that you talked about, and like how you figure out that there is this very weird and deep mind and consciousness kind of thing. When you did your papers and things about consciousness, was it before or after you started doing neuroscience?
It was sort of after, in that I think if you want to try and tackle such a difficult problem as consciousness, you need to know a little bit, I suppose. Especially if you're going to talk about the brain and consciousness. And so, I suppose I'm fortunate because I have studied I've studied psychology from different different angles. I've studied the brain aspect, and I've also studied the depth psychology aspect, which is quite unusual because typically people who study psychology or neuroscience would study it from the perspective of the dominant discipline or model, which is cognitive psychology or cognitive neuroscience, which tends to see the mind and the brain and behavior in a kind of mechanistic information processing sense.
Do you understand like all cognitive sciences and all cognitive related, that frames the thing in a sense that it has something to do with the behavior or consciousness in a way that it goes into people's kind of like feel or feelings?
Well, not necessarily. The way I think of cognitive science is that it uses as a kind of a guide in a way, a model of the mind and the brain that is related to information processing. So the classic information processor that we refer to as the computer.
And now it seems like that the computer relation or computer comparison to brain or mind isn't that good. Do you agree with that?
Yeah,
talk?
I would agree with that. And so I felt dissatisfied actually when I started to progress a little bit in psychology, that the cognitive model was so dominant because I felt I'd got into psychology to try and understand emotion and anxiety and then discovering Freud and the unconscious mind. I wanted to know about that stuff. That felt like the kind of blood and guts of the human condition, I suppose.
When you think about those things, does it have anything to do in your mind about the kind of like the physical relations? Are you interested in just that like subconscious and then that kind of like an abstract reality of mind, or does your wonder go further in a subject in a way that I also want to understand how this happens on a brain level?
So it's both. Yeah, I think bottom line is the experience. If you couldn't have the experience of anxiety, say, or the experience of I don't know, like a drug experience, then what draws you in, and or even just to hear about an account of an altered state of consciousness, for example, and just think, wow, really, people can have that kind of thing. That just sounds...
that's kind of like the most interesting part for me. Like, how don't we talk about it more? In a sense that we all, there's like 7 billion of us, and we all have this thing mind, and we know ways to make it different. In a like very, very drastically different way.
The curious thing is we do talk about it in a way, but we what's the term? We contextualize it and we formalize it into systems like religions.
Yeah, but that feels like it's washing away. Okay, this is a Western viewpoint, and this is especially like a Nordic secular country viewpoint, but it feels like that is washing away so fast, like the unnatural experiences of religion and that. I come from a culture, it's the biggest minority religion in Finland. It's 100,000 people, and it has some very weird rules and very good social surroundings in a way. And part of that religion used to be years ago that there were on these ceremonies, or like, they're not ceremonies, they're very ordinary men in their suits talking about the Bible, and then we all sing and have a coffee kind of thing. And there were old ladies that had these religious ecstasies in a way, that they stood up and they shouted Jesus and clapped their hands and something. And it's the only time in my life that I've seen somebody in an altered mind state, in a way, and all that is slowly fading away. And there's these things that have been around the thousands of years, and in that context, it feels weird that this talk is just slowly rising in a way.
Well, it is interesting, isn't it? And I suppose the word I wanted to find was we institutionalize that aspect of experience.
And you can't do that for a mind in a way.
No, or
an experience. You can't put it on a box in a way.
No, what religions do is they narrativize it. And they make a story.
They tell you how you feel in a way.
And why you feel. That experience you had, that's the Holy Spirit.
Yeah, that's because of God, I told you.
You experienced, God's rapture. But the experience is the experience, the bottom line is the experience. And so the experience exists. And people can experience things as, unusual as entering the spirit world, and they describe this on drugs. For example, we're studying a fascinating compound at the moment called dimethyltryptamine, or DMT. And if you read some of the testimonies of people who have DMT experiences, they're really shocking,
But one thing that's interesting, it's been very interesting. I read some DMT experiences, and now the name is escaping my mind, but he's kind of the dude of the DMT talk, the one that has written most and everything. And I forgot his name right now.
Strassman.
Not Strassman, but it will come to me maybe. But he talked about and he's been talking a lot about this. I remember the exact term, but some ever morphine machine elves and stuff that. Terence McKenna. Yeah, I read some of that, and I was very curious that he wrote it very with a lot of detail and certainty about it. So it's interesting that it has, can somebody relate to it? That's exactly what I saw.
Ish. So, I mean, we've been studying it in the lab. We've been injecting people with escalating doses of DMT, going up to quite high doses. And there's a degree of consistency. And so people will start to experience the changes in perception that you would typically associate with psychedelics, that people see fractal patterns, very complex, beautiful sometimes fractal patterns that are dynamic, that change and morph, and then the experience intensifies and continues intensifying until there's some kind of breakthrough. And then the individual describes being in another world that feels as real as this world, if not more so, realer than real. And this world is populated by these sentient beings that don't seem to be human, but...
I've heard those words, so is that something that comes out often?
Yeah.
And it's... did I get it right? All the tests you've done have been done with people who has previous experience with psychedelics?
Yeah. But except our depression work, when we've given a psychedelic for treatment-resistant depression.
Because what's interesting is that could there be do we already have cases where there's a possibility that these people haven't heard these stories before about it?
So they may well have heard of it and maybe even experienced it. So that's a possibility, but it doesn't feel like a good explanation to me. It's so compelling. The accounts, they're quite detailed, and I really don't think it's priming. How do you demonstrate that? That's something that we can do. In fact, we do ask, and we're going to ask in the next phase of the research whether people are familiar with these accounts of machine elves and such like. I mean, what you do see is that people's descriptions of these entities, that it's not entirely consistent. They can look, quite different. There's not really anything consistent, as far as I can tell, in how they look. But there are some interesting consistencies in that they feel powerful.
Yeah.
And they feel curious about you having entered their world.
I read also some sort of stories of feeling that these sentient beings would be somehow listen to me, or I have something to show or tell you, in a sense.
As in the beings have something to show the tripper. That's right. Yeah. So that can be a feature as well.
How do you compare yourself neuroscientifically or from the psychology viewpoint, the regular dreams we have, to the psychology?
There are similarities there, and one of the similarities is that if it's so immersive that the world feels real, in the same way that a dream, you don't realize it's a dream, you're immersed in this world. And
you believe it as a truth.
And you believe it as a truth, yeah.
And you don't see a difference then if you look in the two things, sleep and like a psychoactive experience, when you look at it from the viewpoint of mind, are they cousins or brothers, or are they from the same family?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. I think what happens in the psychedelic state, to an extent, is that the brain borrows from, in a way, a physiology that occurs during dream sleep. One of the ways to try and understand this experience is to look for examples where similar things can be experienced, and it's quite hard. And so dreaming shares some similarities, but it's not entirely the same.
Yeah.
Another example is the near-death experience.
Oh yeah.
So you can hear accounts of near-death experiences where people feel like they go to another world. They see these powerful beings, or a being that maybe says, you can't come here, or you have to return.
Oh yeah.
Sometimes it's euphoric, sometimes it's dysphoric, and someone returns, and sometimes they think, maybe I'm going to dramatically change how I live my life, Because
that was about my next question. Have you heard any cases where these near-death experiences seem to have a therapeutic effect?
Yeah.
In the same sense that the psychedelics have in their therapeutic
Yeah,
effect.
absolutely. Absolutely. And so, one of the questions is, what are psychedelics doing? And one of the ideas that we've put forward is that they hijack a system and a function in the brain that is there for transformation. And when do transformations occur? Well, they don't occur very often. They might occur if you come close to dying. And they may occur when you have some kind of breakdown or some kind of crisis. That's when you might see examples of people fundamentally changing either their worldview or perhaps as well their behavior.
When the psychedelics do their deed in the therapeutic context, does it require the patient to talk about what he's seen and felt throughout the experience, or is it something that he kind of finds a new truths to live based on, in a way?
It's more of that. It's more that they find a truth. And so it's not that there's a, super wise therapist who is, imparting their wisdom to this person in a state of openness and sensitivity and receptivity. It's more that you have the therapists, and we call them guides or sitters, that kind of hold the space for the tripper, so to speak.
Are telling them that everything's fine.
Yeah, and if they get scared, they say it's okay. Go into it, go with the flow of the experience. But the lessons and the realization of truths happens almost always on the part of the tripper themselves. It's as if the lesson, the insights, the truth is already in our minds, and it's just being occluded. It's just being like hidden from us somehow.
So basically, when it's all happening in the science context, and it has to to fight the stigma and the legacy those things have, it has to be explained throughout like the scientific imaging and the changes in different chemicals and all that. But basically, what does the therapeutic part happens in the mind?
Yeah. And understanding how it works in the brain doesn't add that much to the therapeutic aspect, because when it works, it's working through experience. But if we can understand how it's working therapeutically, we can in some way help to break the stigma, because we can say, we can make comparisons between this treatment and other conventional treatments and say, this is where it's similar, this is where it's different, and show those similarities and differences, not just in terms of the psychology, but also in terms of the brain effects. And that helps, because you can imagine mainstream psychiatry, let's say, being comfortable with its tools, with its antidepressant drugs, with its psychotherapy, with its electroconvulsive therapy. Those are some of the tools. And then they hear about psychedelic drugs and they think, oh, isn't that some hippie thing, and they maybe trivialize it and say, really, come on, don't be so ridiculous. You're telling me that LSD can be useful for depression.
But that, like, if you stop at that, and that's I don't know if it's common, but it's a very understandable viewpoint from the culture, how it's been.
Yeah.
And that's a pretty huge thing in a sense of a human as an animal with the mind, and there can be something that alters the mind in a way that it helps you to live as a person in a way. And then there's like this certainty that no, there's way anything like this could work.
Yeah. Well, there's a great quote that I like, that I heard from an author, a guy called, what's his name? I think it's like Isaac Asimov. He's a sci-fi writer.
Yeah.
I don't think he's around anymore. But it's your assumptions are your windows on the world. Scrub them off every now and again, or the light won't come in. And so there's an example. And conventional psychiatry has been failing for years. It hasn't really made any progress.
And it's been going from my experience, it's been going more and more to the direction of medicalization.
It has. It's been trying to. And I think there's something interesting in the psychology of psychiatry and the psychology of psychiatrists, because psychiatrists are doctors. They've had medical training. And in medicine, there is this desire, this wish for precision. Let's be clinical in our practice. And so wouldn't it be wonderful if we could find a biological marker of depression and then in a targeted way treat that aspect of our biology and cure depression. And so that's been the wish for, however many decades.
But for my viewpoint of how mind or me works, that doesn't make sense, that you just take something out.
No.
Without talking about it.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the curious thing about this aspect of medicine, if you want, the mental aspect, is that you have a subject there. You have someone who can talk to you and say, I am suffering, I am feeling this. And it's incredibly complex because, experience is, the brain is incredibly complex. And the brain isn't just a biological organ that exists in isolation. It's something that is intimately related to the environmental context in which it exists. Because, if your environment is a particular way, you learn, Finnish when you grow up, or if it's in another context, you're learning English or whatever. And so the environmental context is so essential in the context of this particular aspect of medicine, psychiatry. And so this wishful idea that you can, in a precise way, target this aspect of our biology and cure it in a very selective way, that you can, fire in your magic bullet and make everything okay, just isn't the reality. And so, psychedelics are a treatment model that's very different in that sense, because the model says you need to create the perfect conditions as much as possible, the most supportive conditions that you can, and prepare a patient for the experience, and then support them afterwards, help them integrate the experience.
Well, you said earlier that you're looking for the answer, like the scientific answer for how and why psychedelics work as a therapeutic treatment. And would you or the scientific community be happy with the answer, like psychedelics help people cope with certain problems because it makes them face things in a different manner, or things that they haven't faced before? Would that be enough of a scientific answer, or does it has to find some other way to prove it in a way?
Yeah, well, I think we have to prove it.
Prove it numerically, like, yeah, this happens, but do you have to show somehow chemically or somehow that this is why and how it happens?
I think that's kind of like the icing on the cake, is showing how it happens. I think fundamentally, to show, first of all, to report and collect the reports of people saying that this is what's happening, and then measure it in a quantitative way, and look at the relationship between people having insight about the source of their issues, and then showing that having that insight is then predictive of doing well afterwards.
Yeah.
So that's part of the process of proving it. And then to be able to say this mechanism, this process of insight and revelation and subsequent awareness that influences you beyond the experience itself rests on this particular brain mechanism. It's useful.
But for it to become a commonly used medicine in psychotherapy, does it need that?
I think it probably does in a way, because it will
What if it happens only in the mind and you can't show it?
Well,
we have our ways.
We already are showing it, I suppose. Yeah, we are. So
is the neurogenesis part kind of one of the big marks on that field?
That might be part of it.
Was it first time when he, like, your what's the name of the other scientist that we met?
Jordi Reba?
Yeah, like the parts that he showed. Was it on his? About the neurogenesis.
Yeah, so that could be part of it.
Yeah. Was it new info in a sense that it's not like it hasn't been seen before?
Yes.
Yeah.
But he showed it that there's often some limitations or caveats to findings, and so, for example, this was a finding in slices, so it's not actually seeing neurogenesis, the production of new neurons in a living animal. It's producing, it's cut, getting slices of biological material, and then looking at processes, under a microscope. And also it was certain ingredients in ayahuasca, this Amazonian
that made it.
And curiously, it wasn't the psychedelic components that were doing the neurogenesis. So that's part of it, but it's a big picture. You could look at particular circuits in the brain, particular combinations of brain regions, and how they communicate with each other. That also relates to the process, and not just thinking about the brain in terms of spatial regions, but thinking more in terms of the dynamics of brain activity, the quality of the brain activity. For example, whether it is more ordered or disordered. That seems to be part of the picture as well.
Are you familiar with the stoned ape theory?
Yeah.
But for the listeners who doesn't know it, if I've gotten it correctly, the theory goes that when we go back in history and look about of the development of Homo sapiens as a culture and as an animal, that there seems to be a part in the history that can be somehow recalled as an overnight. That's sort of a period of time where people start burying gifts or memories with the dead, and there seems to be something happening with the writing and things like that. That the culture nourishes and develops very fast in a very slow period of time, and the theory goes that that's a period of time when some sort of human animal started eating mushrooms for a period of time. Based on everything you've studied and you know about psychedelics, does this theory hold? Could it be true?
I don't know the anthropology well enough, but I have to be honest that I don't believe the theory. I think it's a bit too wishful about the power of psychedelics. But
if we talk about only about in a technical sense, do you think it could have an effect on a large group of people in a way that they could do new things fast?
Not necessarily. In fact, I think it could disorganize a system and culture, potentially. And so in terms of psychedelic use conferring an evolutionary advantage, I just think that's a bit too wishful. I don't really see the logic there. But a more plausible possibility is that psychedelics work on an aspect of the system, the brain being the system that we're talking about, and the mind, of course, that has been influential in the development of the human mind and the brain, but hasn't necessarily relied on psychedelics as the thing that has catalyzed the development. And so, let me be a bit more clear. Psychedelics work on an aspect of the brain called the serotonin system.
Yeah.
And serotonin is well known to be involved in learning and development and consciousness. There is a particular aspect of the serotonin system called the serotonin 2A receptor that psychedelics work on. And
if you could use a comparison to a car motor or a computer or something, what does serotonin 2A do?
It excites. So it might
it's
be
a
like
spark plug.
or some turbo juice or something.
Yeah, okay.
It gets everything.
If you talk about everyday life, when does it matter? When do you feel it work?
During crises, during pain and punishment. I mean, this is a surprising thing. People think of serotonin as something good. You know, you take MDMA and the brain's flooded with serotonin and you feel amazing. That's true, but if you look at the natural system, when is serotonin released? It's released during pain and punishment and stress.
Do you know why it does the different thing when taken as a substitute?
What's probably happening there is that the brain's releasing something that counteracts the pain.
Okay.
In the same way that we have natural heroin in our brains. They're called endorphins, and they're released when we experience pain. But if you give if you give heroin, you feel pleasure. You don't feel pain. But you know, in terms of the natural system, the natural heroin is released to counteract the pain. And it's a similar thing with serotonin. So the brain releases serotonin to counteract pain and punishment, and it feels good if we give something that boosts serotonin. But so psychedelics work on this 2A aspect of the serotonin system, and my analogy of turbo fuel isn't that good, to be honest, because when people take MDMA or a psychedelic, they don't feel like they're in some turbo state. You know, maybe that would be more like a stimulant.
But is the concessions on turbo state?
No, well, it's like on a. Let me try and think of a good example. It's like we could think of music, and normal waking consciousness is like a concerto. It's like all the instruments are working quite well in harmony, and there's a regularity and a kind of order to the sound, and it feels kind of familiar and it feels good to listen to it. But the psychedelic experience is a bit like experimental jazz. It's like all of a sudden people are getting really anarchic in the way that they're playing the instruments, and there's more information.
But there's still a harmony.
There can be a harmony, that's right. There's still an underlying order. It's not pure chaos. It's not like white noise. It's just more interesting in a way. It's richer. It's richer. Yeah. It's more complex. It's less predictable. And so what's the 2A aspect of things doing? It's kind of allowing for greater flexibility, greater freedom. Does
it show if you take pictures of the brain when the serotonin 2A works, does it make more connections?
You don't see that with brain imaging.
Okay.
You might see that if you use some microscopic techniques.
Okay.
But we see things that...
But do you think it makes sense that if we think as brains as simple as something of things with lines or pipes between them, and there's things going cross and making connections, do those connections multiply in a psychedelic
Yeah, we
experience?
do see that. So we see that different regions in the brain talk to each other with greater freedom during the psychedelic state. So we've got these kind of different lines of inquiry, these kind of converging lines of evidence that say that during the psychedelic experience, the brain is more plastic. It can be influenced more easily.
Oh, yeah.
And so coming back to, the function of serotonin and the serotonin 2A receptor, when would you need to be plastic and be able to change your mind or your behavior? Maybe when things are so tough that you simply need to change to survive, if not to survive physically, just to survive mentally, to not lose the plot. And that kind of makes sense if we think of when naturally you might have an experience that is somehow akin to a psychedelic experience. And you might, for me, the most likely candidate are crisis experiences when, you have a kind of breakdown and, your life isn't working.
Your life isn't what it used to be.
And you need to change, you need to get back to basics and have some clarity, because something is wrong. It's not working, and that's where you can have something similar to a psychedelic experience. And I imagine and hypothesize that it's this same system that's involved there, this serotonin system. And in terms of the evolution thing and the stoned ape thing, maybe that's why that system is there. It's so that when things are difficult or when they're not working, we can go back to basics and go back to what's fundamental and have clarity and transform ourselves and our minds.
As a person who haven't had a psychedelic experience yet, the stoned ape theory somehow makes sense to me in a way that, if I understand it correctly, it makes people see maybe options they haven't seen before in their personal lives, to see things in a different light. And when that sort of experience becomes a communal experience, something you experience with other people, I think that kind of strengthens the effect of how that new knowledge affects somebody's behavior or doing. Like when it happens only to you, it's more likely to be inner growth or new me or something like that. But when it happens on a collective level, it somehow makes sense to me that people would come up with new complicated things because they kind of all believe in the possibility of it more.
I suppose I could be more receptive to the stoned ape idea if they didn't have to be stoned from a psychedelic. It's possible to have that openness through the system itself, I think is the point I'd want to make. And what influences the system itself? Well, our environmental conditions do. And what drives evolution? It's environmental conditions. We need something that's going to confer some kind of survival advantage. And so it follows that it's more likely that it's nature adapting than some kind of technology, a drug, a plant, that then influences nature. And I don't think there are many examples of the consumption of a particular plant that has then, maybe there is, that's then driven the evolution of a particular organism. I'd like to, understand some examples where that's happened in order to be like, oh yeah, okay. Also in the anthropological records, I'd want it to be a bit more compelling that actually it was mushroom use that led to these developments. For me, I sort of feel like it's almost a way for people who are familiar with psychedelics, perhaps have used them, perhaps have a positive regard towards them, to almost defend their power and importance. And I just think it's unnecessary. We don't need to do that. They're interesting enough as they are.
Yeah, because I strongly feel like that these stories of the possibilities wouldn't be so strong if it wasn't so suppressed. It's been sort of a secret for anybody who's in the know.
Yeah.
And then all this that has been pushed away makes more sense and it's more compelling.
I think that's it. It's almost like a, passive aggressive. It's like an aggression because of a defense,
Yeah.
Look, you don't like psychedelics, but they shaped your consciousness.
Yeah. But if you think about how big of a thing, in a sense of how mind works, it is even these days. And if we think about the nature of a mushroom, it's very likely that throughout the years people have eaten it.
Yeah, but the curious thing is, you often find that they haven't celebrated them, at least in the West.
Yeah, because that's very interesting to me, that if there's something in the forest that alters your mind in that manner, why doesn't it show more in a historical context? It seems to come up with South American cultures, and
that's true. So they've embraced it, and
they've painted it and they've made marks about it.
And arguably they have some of these indigenous cultures have a wisdom that our culture doesn't, and
that is very interesting.
And maybe they're healthier, maybe they're happier.
More developed mathematics at earlier stage.
Okay, well, that's more like an analytical side of things.
Yeah.
But in terms of well-being, they may have more well-being. Whereas, the Western world, we've been more driven and analytical and wanting to take from nature rather than live in harmony with nature. Yeah.
It's not faking or lying to say that it based on the ways that it's talked about, that it changes humanity in a way, that it changes your experience drastically. You will experience something that you never experienced before.
Yeah, I think that's true. Yeah, I mean that is the truth. That's not over egging psychedelics. That's just the truth. If that wasn't the case, they couldn't be so useful in psychiatry.
Yeah.
Or they couldn't be so useful as tools to understand consciousness.
Do you think in the consciousness studies, these studies will have a hand over time? The psychedelic studies that happen in the therapy surrounding, will these give new information to consciousness studies?
Yeah, I think there's a complementarity to the approaches, and so by understanding how psychedelics alter the structure of consciousness and, for example, facilitate access to the unconscious mind by dissolving the ego, that tells us something about the organization and the structure of consciousness.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it tells us something about how we might use this tool therapeutically.
Yeah, that's right.
Because it may say the ego restricts our view of ourselves and works to defend us, but those defenses can make us sick because they create a conflict with what's underneath that's been repressed, that's been kept from our conscious awareness, because it's painful, because we don't want to be reminded of it, or because we don't want to integrate, that experience or that memory with ourselves and who we think we are.
So in that sense, the therapy maybe works in a way that it helps you to dissolve the ego and see yourself or the things without too much of the ego coming in.
Yeah, just see your mind and see the world, see other people.
Do people feel, I've been thinking about this when sometimes, for example, when I'm very, very tired and I, like in the middle of the night or something, and I have this sometimes when I go to have a pee and I'm very tired and I kind of feel like I zone out. I forget my body for a while. Is that something that people have reported, that like they feel bodiless? That it's poor mind, it's not with the body anymore in a sense?
There is a bit of that. I wouldn't say it's a classic signature aspect of the psychedelic excuse me, the psychedelic experience. It might be something that you would associate more with dissociatives like ketamine, for example. But the curious thing with psychedelics is that you can still pretty much function in terms of like moving. You can still...
If somebody walks into your DMT session and there's a fire and you have to run, can you do it?
People say that you can snap out of the state, even if it's really, really weird and immersive. If there was a fire, in the other room, you could snap out of it, and to some extent, you could get out and be okay. So it's not like the effects of a high dose of alcohol, for example, where you are truly incapacitated and you can't move, you can't talk.
You can't change that.
No.
With alcohol. Yeah.
No, you can't as well. You're just there. There's no antidote.
No.
But that's the curious thing about psychedelics, is that they seem to have a fundamental action on perception, and particularly visual perception, but also on consciousness itself. It almost seems like a targeted action on consciousness. And people will say that when they have an experience with a psychedelic, it feels like something is fundamentally different. It's like if they have a little drink or a big drink, it's like something of this world and this way of experiencing this world has changed. It's easy to be sort of disinhibited and kind of jolly and a bit sloppy with things and kind of disinhibited and sort of chatty and loud maybe, or you get stoned and you're still in this world, but you feel kind of relaxed and your muscles are relaxed and you feel kind of dopey, and then you get flights of ideas and that's fun, but you're still in this world. But you take a psychedelic and it's like just you can still move around and you're still as conscious as you ordinarily are, and you can pretty much hold a conversation, but something is fundamentally different, and that's such a curious thing that psychedelics can do that.
Is there cases in therapeutics where people have recorded speaking the thoughts during the psychedelic experience, like trying to like make it into words real time? A
bit. I mean, we've done interviews with people, structured interviews after psychedelic experiences, and then we've analysed the language that people use. One thing that we found was that ordinarily when you do that with people, they refer more to the past and to the future. In conversations I might bring up, I don't know, when I was studying psychology as a kid, or what's going to happen later on, or in the future, But on a psychedelic, people are much more in the present. That's kind of curious. I mean, they can have recollections about the past, but at least in that little study that we did, we found that people were much more likely to be just talking about the here and now. Whether that's something that you see with a lot of drugs because you're thinking about where you are because you're on a drug, it's a reasonable question to ask. But one possibility is that it's similar to what happens during mindfulness meditation, for example, and this principle of mindfulness that you be present-centered, you be in the here and now. You don't daydream about the future or the past, or who you're going to meet later on, and you get your phone out. It's like you're here and appreciate here, and so that's one thing we see.
And as you told on the lecture on Wednesday, that the similarities with mindfulness doesn't stop there. That there's more curious things between those two, right?
Yeah, there are. I mean, ego dissolution is one. That when you focus on an object, let's say it's your breath in meditation, you can become so immersed in that object that you don't see a difference between you and your breath. You become your breath. And so there's this dissolution of boundaries between self and other. Or you're staring at a candle and no longer is it candle and you staring at the candle, but you are the candle.
So the unity experience.
Yeah, the unitive experience, And of course that's very, very difficult to achieve in meditation, but it's much more reliably achieved with psychedelics.
About my friend's questions, this you kind of touched before, but how... like if you think about things that we know are good or works with human body, whatever biological or whatever chemical things, how well are we equipped for psychedelics? How responsive or how good of a match our brain and those things are when they meet?
That's a really good question because, it's very rare in normal life to have anything like a psychedelic experience. Dreaming is about as close as you can come. Near-death experiences, you only typically have an experience like that when you actually die.
Yeah.
And crises, hopefully you don't have, too many major crises. And when you do, are they still, really equivalent to a psychedelic experience?
The crisis fuzzes the experience in a way too.
The crisis
fuzzes the experience.
It might not always be a situation of clarity. It might just be confusion.
Yeah.
That's true. The same could be true with psychedelics, actually. That, the clarity can be preceded by a period of confusion and anxiety and struggle. So there is this question of, do psychedelics stimulate the brain to non-natural levels? Even though they're natural, it is kind of curious that humans too seem to be the only animal that will actively take psychedelics. Other animals seem to try and avoid psychedelics, actually. So, rodents won't self-administer psychedelics like they would self-administer alcohol, for example, or an opioid like morphine or heroin or whatever.
Do you know if there's any recorded events of monkeys taking psychedelics in the
monkeys
jungle?
are given psychedelics.
Okay.
And this is another kind of challenge to the stoned ape theory. They don't seem to get any smarter. If you give them to rodents, they tend to shake their heads a lot. They call them wet dog shakes or head shakes, and it's as if they're tripping and they're trying to shake it off. Yeah, shake it off, or they think they've got something on their fur and they want to shake that off.
But about the unnatural levels.
Yeah. So are we equipped to have a psychedelic experience? Well, in a way we're not, but we're also. It's a bit like, are we equipped for any extreme experience? We're not that well equipped because we're inducing an extreme experience, so it's really challenging us. But there is something to be said about overcoming the challenge, and coming through the other side, and the process of kind of accomplishment in a way, and what can be realized after a process of challenge and struggle, and then overcoming the struggle.
How familiar are you with the psychedelics and addiction studies?
Yeah, quite familiar.
When somebody drops off of heroin, for example, because of psychedelics, is it something that he figures out differently and can do better?
I think that's part of it. I think, when you are addicted to something, you have this intimate relationship with a particular thing. Maybe it's the case that you have a polydrug addiction. You are an opiate user, you inject heroin, but you also smoke some crack
and drink.
And so it's like a general attachment to drugs as a way to cope and deal with whatever it is, trauma or isolation, a lack of meaning and purpose, or a disconnection. And so what you're doing with the addiction is finding a purpose. You're finding a meaning and a direction, and you are finding a connection. You have an intimate connection to your object or objects of addiction. But I think what psychedelics allow you is a kind of some fresh air from that, and also a bigger picture view, So instead of just seeing the tree of this is my object of addiction, you can zoom right out and see the whole of the woods,
maybe the roots even.
Maybe the roots, yeah. And you can see that there is a way of connecting to yourself. Maybe you relive traumas that have been at the root of your addiction and the development of life that's led to your addiction. And you go into those traumas and you relive them, but you sit with them and you see them in a fresh perspective, maybe with a fresh objectivity rather than being, purely a subject to those traumas.
When the patients talk about it after getting over addiction with the help of psychedelics, do they talk about it as a revolutionary or revelationary experience where they saw things differently and could act on that?
Yes. So they talk about this moment of clarity. You hear the term moment of clarity in the context of, say, alcohol dependence. That someone may go
also
through...
becoming religious.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And that's one of the, aspects of the classic 12 steps model for treating alcohol dependence, that at the end you achieve some self-actualization and sense of connection to a purpose, a higher purpose. And it might be God, it might be religion, but perhaps it doesn't need to be. That's just an institutionalized...
a branded version.
Yeah, a branded version of something that's more fundamental. I think that's the thing with psychedelics, that they can show you the fundamental, and it's the same thing, and it's the thing that religions have realized, and major figures in different religions have all realized the same thing, but they've gone and branded it.
Yeah, and told a different story.
Yeah, or their followers have.
I heard there's a study starting now in the US where they give psychedelics to priests of different religions.
Yeah.
And they first, it was due to be maybe 3 settings over the course of 9 months or something like that. And so they were only through the first sitting, and it was maybe 7 or 8 priests of different religious groups like Jews and Lutheran and all that. And the first experiences were that their religious feeling towards God got stronger, but the boundaries between religions got lower, or dissolved.
Yeah,
and that was, I think, was very interesting. My friend's last question was about. Maybe you answered part of this. That why do you think in sense of evolutionary biology, like why did this skill or capability to experience higher or alternate experience, why did it develop? Or was it, do you think it was an accident, or his one suggestion is that it's for the consciousness to find ways to grow or evolve?
Yeah. In a way, another possibility is that it's kind of the other way round. We've evolved this kind of consciousness. Maybe, if we follow the principles of evolution, we've developed this form of consciousness because it's given us an edge. And in reality, if you look at the Earth, humans have developed an edge. They've managed to control the rest of nature.
Yeah.
But it's made us sick, right? Or it seems to have made not just us sick, but the planet sick.
Yeah.
And so maybe it's not that psychedelics played a role in or this state of consciousness played a role in our evolution, but rather we've suppressed that mode of consciousness because we've developed this mode of consciousness that's given us an advantage. But it may have allowed us to flourish as a species, but at the cost of our mental health, perhaps. But more importantly, the rest of the earth. We are damaging the earth.
Yeah, we're doing stupid shit.
Yeah, and so another possibility is that the psychedelic state is more similar to an older form of consciousness.
Ah, okay.
Yeah,
that's right. that the nature somehow evolved us away from that kind of feeling towards surrounding.
And so I've heard this term, in fact, I kind of made it up.
It's a very brave moment when you realize that I have to take the credit for this.
Well, I looked it up to see if it's ever been used elsewhere, and it has, but in a derogatory way by right-wing people with reference to Barack Obama, actually.
Yeah.
And it's this term of a progressive regression. And it's like you regress by going back to the source, to like your earlier mode of consciousness, the psychedelic state of consciousness, or the pre-ego state of consciousness. But you do it with psychedelics where you can then come back into this state of consciousness, but bringing with it the lessons that you've learned from going to your earlier state of consciousness. So you regress, but it's a progressive regression because you bring something back.
Have there been studies made about people who have, for example, years of experience of recreational psychedelic usage in almost a therapeutic setting, as a not as a party drug, but as a personal relaxation thing or whatever? Have there been studies about those people, if there's something in common in their behavior or in the way they work around?
So people who take psychedelics in what way?
Like in their personal use, like they recreational psychedelic use.
Yeah. So there kind of is, and so there's been a population study by a scientist in the States where he sampled, or rather someone else sampled a large cross-section of the US population, like 200,000 people or something. Not a large, but a decent cross-section. And then looked at a number of different factors, all the kind of obvious things in terms of demographics, education, age, gender, race, whatever, and also drug use, and then different kinds of drug use, and also mental health. And what they found was a interesting anomalous relationship between use of psychedelics and mental health. Anomalous in the sense that when people take drugs, usually there's a negative relationship between drug use and mental health. So the more drugs you take, the worse your mental health. But psychedelics bucked that trend,
it was the other way around.
It was the other way around. So people who'd taken psychedelics had better mental health.
Because I think one interesting part of that anomalous relationship is that we live in cultures where they're illegal. You get caught, it creates problems. It's a secret. It's something usually that you have to hide, and it's something that's kind of taught us to be a reason to feel bad about yourself in a sense.
Yeah. So
I think that might play a factor in the number of people having mental problems when using drugs.
Yeah, possibly. Yeah, that they're feeling guilty. And I've heard, a friend of mine's a psychiatrist, and I was asking him, what's going on with heroin addicts, because I don't understand them. And he said a lot of the time they're using to forget, because they'll use, then they'll withdraw, then they'll be desperate because they need a hit. Then they'll do something stupid like go and shoplift or like steal from their mum or something. And then they feel so awful about it that they need to forget about it. And so there's this cycle, and it's exactly the same with alcohol as well, that, people do awful stuff when they're drunk, and then they come around to sobriety and they're like, I can't deal with this awful stuff that I've done, so I need to get drunk again.
Crazy. Going a little bit back to consciousness, I'm borrowing this question from a panel discussion I found on YouTube where there was different people from different fields of science talking about it, and the question was, how far is science in understanding consciousness?
Yeah, we've got a way to go, but we've made some inroads. And one of the issues, a major issue with consciousness, is the lack of a really clear definition of what we mean by consciousness. And my own view is that we only are really interested in this issue of consciousness because we have it as humans. And so this point of view could be accused of being a bit human-centric, like, favouring humans over other animals and only being interested in humans. But I think the reality is that it's only really humans that have a quality of consciousness that allows them to think it's a problem at all, or a question at all.
That's how I feel about it, yeah.
And so then that can help you sharpen your definition of the thing that you want to understand, which is, what is human consciousness? And then you realise, well, one of the things about human consciousness is that we develop this sense of self, and part of the function of this sense of self, in the broad sense, is that it allows us to reflect, to self-reflect. And when we sharpen our definition in that way, we can think of brain systems or aspects of brain function that relate to self-reflection and looking inwards. And when we do that, we realise that, there is this system that engages when we self-reflect. In fact, it's actually a system that dominates the brain ordinarily. It consumes more energy than elsewhere in the brain, and it gets more blood flow than elsewhere in the brain. It's actually a system called the default mode network, because it's kind of related to a default mode of being. When you switch off from, having this conversation or whatever, and you're on your own and you're reflecting, it's this default mode that's always there. It's a kind of background level of consciousness and awareness.
Is there anything that happens if you, or is it even technically possible to, in any shape or form or technical device, to look at somebody's brain, or to somehow record it, and then when somebody's, like, for example, lying in some sort of a scanner and you're told to wait there, and then you're already recording the action, and then you say, can you please think about yourself or your consciousness?
Yeah.
Does something happen?
Yeah, it does. And what happens is this default mode network increases in activity. So it becomes engaged. I actually thought you were going to ask the opposite. Is there something that you can do when people are in a scanner where you shut off or dissolve that aspect of consciousness, where you can think of yourself and reflect on yourself, and there is, and it's giving psychedelics. Another one would be to be able to properly immerse in a meditation such that you forget yourself.
So in a way, in the regular sense of how we think consciousness works, that part of the brain kind of zones out when you take psychedelics.
It does. It sort of disintegrates.
And still people remember things and experiences.
Yeah, which is bizarre. And what that tells us is that there's a state of consciousness that you can have where you're just as awake as you are right now, except you don't see the world through your ego. And that experience is comparable to a so-called mystical experience.
Because not seeing something through your ego sounds also somehow non-bodily or non-personal.
Yeah, that's kind of part of it, in the sense that people don't feel so separate from things. They feel connected to things. They feel connected to other people. They feel connected to their emotions, but they also feel connected in a sort of global sense. They feel connected to nature.
Yeah.
This experience of connectedness is probably at the essence of the unitive experience. It's this sense of oneness, of interconnectedness.
And all meditative cultures have always talked about it.
Yeah, and religions as well.
Yeah. Yeah, the Christian religion, not that much lately. But yeah, that's right. And
well, a communion with God, perhaps.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, but in their explanation, there's always somebody else.
Yeah,
like it somehow mix matches with the other stories.
That's true.
But on that panel of how far is science in understanding consciousness, there was one scientist. I don't remember the field he was from, but he said that one thing that he likes to toy with, or he thinks that we have to toy with, is that because we don't yet know where the consciousness, like biologically or chemically, happens. Like we don't specifically can tell what happens and when and how. And he says that we have to think about the possibility that it comes from somewhere else in some sort of a way. That there's, for example, a common consciousness where you're one encapsulated in your ego or in your body is part of, in a way. And he just told that in a manner of it's just something that we have to like think about as a possibility because we can't show where it comes from.
Yeah.
And I like for 20 something years since birth, I was taught that what happens after the death, and there was a very, very graphic and clear explanation what happens after the death. And when I didn't believe in it anymore, I started trying to find or figure out the different options in a way. Because I think in Western cultures we have two possible outcomes for death. The one feels like it felt before you were born, and then the Christian experience. Those are kind of like the two main alterations. And from that point, when the scientists talked about that there's a possibility that consciousness comes from maybe somewhere else or something common, I've been thinking about like maybe one way of what death does in a way is that it just dissolves the ego, and there's some sort of something continues in a way of that only the consciousness exists after the death, but without the ego in a sense.
Possibly, yeah. I mean, who knows? I guess as a materialist scientist, I imagine, and I don't know, and I can never test it because you can't, that when you die, you have a altered state of consciousness, and you experience a state of consciousness without ego, and it's there, and maybe it's bliss. Maybe it's struggle first, but then maybe it's bliss, and then it's bliss, and it's bliss, and it's gone, you know, because then you need something, you need some heart beating or something to have some experience. But when it's gone, you're still matter that's of this universe, and you degrade and putrefy, and other organisms come along depending on what's happened to your body, and they consume that material and energy, and then the cycle goes on, and it's an infinite cycle until the earth dies because maybe, you know, we do something as humans, or the sun does something like dies.
Yeah.
But the universe doesn't. And there is so in that sense, there is an infinite. The really scary thing about all of this is that we don't go on, you know.
Yeah, but about like your possible view of that, I think there's an interesting part where the ego dissolves off. What if there's not time there? Like what if the concept of time dies with your ego? So then the short period of time you get for free from your body, leaving the energy, it feels like eternity.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Maybe. It's possible.
A scientific explanation to eternal.
Time doesn't matter. So, yeah.
But it's interesting because I got interested in the subject maybe 2, 3, 4 years ago and started reading papers, and I started watching like somehow collections or experiences that people tried to explain what happened, and then it started to be more from the scientific therapeutic viewpoint and everything. And then there's something that I can't easily grasp about, like, what do we talk about when we talk about psychedelics? If you like, for example, everything you guys talked about on Wednesday about everything that happens, there still feels like this is the scientific view of the subject in a scientific context, but actually the thing itself might happen outside these numbers and figures and pictures. And I somehow feel like that the war on drugs and the culture around the drugs somehow dims down the conversation. Do you, for example, does it make your work more, does it complicate your work that you basically work with drugs?
Yeah.
In what ways?
It makes it, as Geordie said the other day over dinner, that it makes it unreasonably difficult to do the work. Just the bureaucracy and the practicalities of it and the stigma and how that can feed into the bureaucracy and stiffen it to make it even more impenetrable. It makes it unreasonably difficult. And I really felt for Geordie because it was sounding like he didn't have the collaborative support that I had. I mean, it wasn't always there. There was a lot of common feeling actually when he was telling me about it, because I remember when I started in David Nutt's team, I was kind of on my own. You know, it was me and David was sympathetic, but not really anyone else in the team were.
Were there some things that you did first time in UK?
Yeah.
Was taking psychedelic in a therapeutic scientific surrounding. Did you do that first time?
Yeah.
And how big of a pain in the ass was that to get approved?
Yeah, it was a massive pain in the ass.
How long
it took us 3 years to even get the drug. And you can imagine, you know...
How long it took to get the permit to give it to a person?
There are a number of different components that feed into getting the permission to give it to a person. And so you need the drug to be of a sufficient quality for us to give it to a person.
I've heard about this regarding the MAPS and the MDMA thing, that they kind of have the approvals, but they have to get very expensive drug.
Yeah, and the reality is you can get drug that's just the drug, and that's kind of easier, much easier actually. But if you want to get a drug that's got a piece of paper that says this is fine for it to go to humans, all of a sudden the price and the process are like just, you know...
Yeah, that's what I meant, because I heard that these guys who run MAPS could do the drug themselves with a couple, a light sign, with a couple €1,000, but if you want to have it legally, it's going to be very, very complicated.
That's kind of it, yeah. If you want to give it to patients, all of a sudden it's like, you know, at least 10 times as expensive. You know, and so it cost us £15,000 or €15,000 roughly to give a dose of psilocybin to our patients, and that you know, think about it, that's kind of insane. Yeah, it's like £15,000 for like a few little capsules
for a mushroom.
Yeah, whereas you could pick a mushroom out of the ground. You know, you might pick the wrong one and all that kind of thing.
But how do you feel now? Not the technical part, but the cultural part of it. How you talk about it and how you have to explain your work and all that. How do you feel about it being a drug?
Yeah, I mean, it is. I sort of feel like that will change when there is sufficient scientific evidence to change it, and I think maybe we're there already. If we're rational about this, we are there already. You know, psilocybin doesn't have an exceptionally high abuse potential. It's not particularly dangerous in relation to other drugs of potential misuse, and it does have medicinal potential. So it doesn't meet its criteria for it to be a Schedule 1 drug. And that's obvious to me now as a scientist, you know, working...
and it still is in many places, right?
It is. I mean, it's a UN classification, so it covers, you know, effectively anyone who signs up to that UN charter.
So it doesn't fit the criteria how the phase 1 is built?
No, it doesn't. But the system still says it does. So, you know...
Do you think there's a process that tries to fix or do something about it?
Yeah, there is a building lobby to challenge that scheduling. But I think it will take the scientists to drive that lobby. I don't think people will make the change, really, although that's been tried. There've been, you know, sort of artists and businessmen, you know, Richard Branson, whatever, or, you know, musicians, Sting, or former US presidents, you know, Carter, signing this, like, you know, this statement to say that the scheduling needs to be changed. But I sort of feel like, you know, the scientists should know better than anyone, really, in terms of a drug's medicinal potential and also harm potential.
Yeah.
And so they should inform this debate. And I think, you know, some kind of consensus statement from scientists. But what will really add to the case will be the accumulation of more and more evidence.
Oh, yeah.
And then it will become like just a tipping point. There's just too much in terms of evidence to you know, maintain this the current system of scheduling, because it will just seem insane. It won't be based on evidence or logic.
And I feel like that might be happening with a lot of things in the future. Somehow I feel that way. Two questions I want to ask before we wrap this up. The first one is a shorter one. Have you felt any drag? Like, if you talk with people who has been interested or into these things for tens of years, and it's usually people who it's often people who see forces in the community or in nations that do things and make things slower. Do you feel like your studies with psychedelics have been somehow dragged or tried to slow down, or any way or form make your work harder, in a sense? Is there forces that doesn't want you to succeed, do you feel like?
I do, but I think, you know, that drag has come from the stigma, mostly.
From the structure, from the infrastructure of how things how things work.
But like a psychological infrastructure as much as the actual infrastructure. But that, to an extent, so for example, to do the research, you need a license, a Schedule 1 license. And it takes time to get these licenses. They are increasingly managed, in the sense that you have checks to make sure that you're keeping tabs on your store of your Schedule 1 drug, and they're expensive. They cost a few £1,000s, and so if you're a rat researcher, and you have limited funding, you're not really going to go to the trouble of getting a Schedule 1 license to research psychedelic drugs, because it's much easier to do some work with, serotonin itself, or fluoxetine, you know, an SSRI, an antidepressant, because they're just easier to get and you don't need a license. Yeah. And so what happens is there's this huge body of work and evidence around, say, SSRIs, and it can influence and inspire theories about, say, serotonin, because these SSRIs, these antidepressants, work on serotonin, and so people start thinking of serotonin in a particular way because all the work has been done based on SSRIs and not on psychedelics, because it's so hard to do the work with the psychedelics, and so it is kind of biasing science. It's impoverishing science. And so that simple and this is something really, really important, and I think the way that the system tries to drag and hold back psychedelic research is subtle, and they do this intentionally, in my view, so that they can't be charged with an active blocking of the research. And my feeling is that they did the same thing in the 1960s, and what we have now is a kind of vestige of what was done in the 60s. But what happened in the 60s was that they didn't effectively say you can't do any more psychedelic research. They just changed the bureaucracy in such a way that it was so hard to do psychedelic research that it effectively became impossible.
Do you see any of the reasons or kind of like the factors why this would be the case nowadays?
Well, I think if they were to try it nowadays, people would call it out and say, "Look, there's something going on here." And I mean, this happened in the 60s. You have an example of, an individual who was quite likely to become the president of the United States, Bobby Kennedy, JFK's brother, who is a senator, and he's lobbying, or he's making the case for the continuation of research with LSD and other psychedelics. And he's coming up against other people of power who are trying to change the system to make it difficult to do the psychedelic research. And he's saying, I don't understand what's going on here. I'm not getting a clear answer. Why is this research not of value anymore? And but people just kind of, cloud the issue so that you don't get that clear answer. And I think if they were to try that again today, I just sort of feel like we've learnt so much from history that we would know the game that they're playing. But it's so difficult to say. Maybe they would create some fake news. They kind of do that now anyway. They'll attribute a fatality to a psychedelic when there's no scientifically plausible way that the psychedelic could have killed someone.
Yeah, because I personally feel like that I think I understand you're referring to they, in this sense I think I kind of get it what you mean, and I feel like that it could be completely plausible that the they in this case are the kind of like we've always done things this way. There's no need to change anything. Culture that it's very, very deeply rooted in everything we do.
Yeah,
like this is the way we've always done things. Why this should be changed? Please, I have more important things to do.
Yeah, it's kind of a reactionary and a conservative position. The thing is, it's quite easy to highlight some statistics that say mental health is, a leading contributor to the global burden of disease. It's hugely costly.
Yeah.
It affects 1 in 3 people within their lifetime, a mental disorder, and the rates are increasing. Suicide is the biggest killer of young men under the age of 40.
I heard some alarming numbers about suicide, and the thing is that suicide doesn't get talked about too often. It's not a news.
Yeah. Well, there you go. So there's a lot that you can pull up in terms of statistics that say, look, this aspect of society isn't working.
Yeah.
There's a large chunk of the population, 30%, who will get a psychiatric disorder within their lifetime. Surely we should do something about that. And so things aren't working, and we shouldn't keep them the same.
So what we're basically waiting for is more open discussion. We kind of like to break down the stigma, and the scientific findings could help us with that.
I think so. Yeah, I think so. We need to, open up the conversation, and that's what's happening, right now, and more throughout the world. And it's a really healthy thing. And change, works best when it can occur at the right pace. Yeah. If it's rushed, people react too strongly and try and stop it. And if it's too slow, nothing happens. So we just need to keep things, going at the right pace and build the body of evidence that we need, so that there's that tipping point where it suddenly becomes insane, to keep psychedelics restricted and not be available as medicines.
I'm very, very interested in that. My last question, from a kind of like a little boy's point of view, as somebody looking at humanity in a wide scale throughout your years in the psychedelics and around the psychedelics culture, what is kind of like the thing that somebody's experienced, you saw, seen, you heard, something around the psychedelics that fits perfectly the adjective of weird or interesting? What are kind of like the weirdest things you've seen around the psychedelics, if you to think about your patients throughout the years or something? What comes in mind?
Yeah. Well, if I think about the first patient who was in our depression trial, she would come and see us before we decided that she would be in, and we would give her psilocybin. And she was a pleasant and polite lady, but no emotion there really, except when we started to get to know her and we were asking about her backstory, and she would get upset and she would start crying. And it was just misery. This woman was miserable, thoroughly miserable. But she was nice, but she was so sad. And then, going into the psilocybin session, just to see the transformation was dramatic. Behaviorally, she was doing things that were kind of weird. She was lying in the bed, but she started moving her hands as she was coming up on the psilocybin, and she was moving them in this almost like kind of Indian dancing, with her hands doing the movement and the dancing, like flowers, sort of, petals opening up. It was beautiful to watch. And she was doing something else as well, where she was moving her legs up and down on the bed. And we were kind of nervous, because we were nervous anyway. It was the first session. And we were like, what the hell is she doing there? And then the music is playing in the room. The music doesn't just play to a patient in headphones that they wear on their head. It plays through speakers in the room.
Do they choose the music?
No, we choose the music just to try and standardize that. And we craft it in a particular way so that it builds up, and it takes them on a journey. And so, she's crying and there's all this emotion. And then she's coming down and she's smiling, and I haven't seen her smile before. And she's got a beautiful smile. And later on, we asked people to write something about their experience. And she was saying that she was visited by a kind of guardian angel, a sort of spirit who was like a kind of... She was a bit like her great aunt, I think she was saying, or maybe her grandmother. Someone really maternal and caring and gentle and warm. And she said that this angel would talk to her in these caring terms, like, "My dear, it's okay, my dear. Why are you so sad? Let me take that weight off your shoulders, and you should smile more. You've got such a beautiful smile." And she was pushing, apparently, she felt the angel like pushing her cheek muscles up to make her smile. "Smile, my child, smile, my dear." And this was pretty moving, reading that, because, it just felt so right and so beautiful. And how could anyone, tell you that this is wrong and that this shouldn't happen? Someone who'd had depression since she was a teenager, who'd thrown, 6 or 7 different drugs at their depression to try and treat it, had tried years of psychotherapy with no breakthrough. Yeah. And then we give them this plant medicine, this psilocybin, and there's this transformation. How can someone dare to say that that's wrong?
In that specific case, do you think how it lasted?
Yeah, it lasted for a good few weeks and a few months. And so you might think, oh well, that's a bit modest, know, but it was one experience. Yeah. When you take a conventional antidepressant, you're taking it every day. When you're having psychotherapy, you're going in at least once a week, usually a few times a week. And this was just one session. And so there's a case to be made for, when this rolls out, as I think it will, and it does become a licensed medicine, people can go in for top-up doses, so she can have a booster dose to bring
or
her
if
back.
you can change those experience.
Yeah.
You can make more sense by re-experiencing and having new angles to the same experience.
Yeah, or you do something to work on your lifestyle, to try and cultivate a way of thinking that stops you from, being dragged back into the old negative way of thinking.
Hey, thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
It's very much been a pleasure, and thank you for all the work, because it's easy to understand that it's not easy.
Yeah, it's pretty.
So thank you for doing it.
Yeah, pleasure.
Thank you. All the best.
Artlab.